These apple trees, almost 30 years old, have always blossomed faithfully, surrounded by the hum of my honeybees. But for so many years, a late freeze has always come, either disrupting pollination or ruining the fruit. This year, however, I actually got to enjoy a small but much appreciated harvest. The apples are not the prettiest since I didn't spray for pests, but I knew they would be perfect for applesauce, and I planned to utilize the scraps to make vinegar. I gave the fruit a good wash with my homemade cleaner, which consists of white vinegar, water, a little dish soap, and a few drops of rosemary and spearmint essential oils. It's so simple and very effective. Then I began peeling the apples by hand, which allows me to inspect each one and remove any blemishes. Once peeled, I sliced the apples into small pieces and added them to a bowl of water acidified with citric acid to halt the browning process. I carefully separated any bad pieces from the good scraps, which I set aside for making homemade apple cider vinegar. Well, technically apple scrap vinegar. Next, I simmered the apple chunks with slices of homegrown ginger, a cinnamon stick, and a big squeeze of some of my crystallized honey, about half a cup. The warming spices and ginger filled the air, and as the apples softened, I helped to break them down a bit into a thick, chunky sauce. While those simmered, I tended to a batch of kombucha that I had been brewing. First, I always make a batch of strong black tea and then let it cool before adding the SCOBY from my last batch, along with about a half a cup of sugar and a cup of kombucha as the starter. I make half-gallon jars, which takes me a week or so to drink, and I have 3 jars in rotation. So one is fresh, one is still fermenting, and one is ready to drink. It's my cheap and easy method. Once the apples are tender and the sauce is at the desired consistency, I remove the ginger and cinnamon stick. Then I added lemon juice to get the proper pH for canning. Using an immersion blender, I pureed the mix until silky smooth, transforming the chunky sauce into a perfectly creamy applesauce. And to preserve this sweet bounty, I ladled the applesauce into clean jars, making sure to wipe the rims before adding the lids and bands. I then processed the jars according to the ball recipe, using a mix of half-pint jars and smaller 4-ounce jars for convenience. These smaller jars are perfect for individual servings or for gifting. And after the required time, I remove all the jars and let them cool completely, making sure that each one has a good seal, indicated by that classic pop. After they're cool, I'll label them and remove the bands. And then I set out to turn the leftover apple scraps, the peels, the cores, and bits that would otherwise go into the compost, into some homemade apple cider vinegar. I put the scraps into a clean half-gallon jar. For every cup of water, I added 1 tablespoon of sugar, which is essential for fermentation. Then I used a leak-proof lid to give the jar a good shake to help dissolve the sugar, and then I covered the jar with a breathable cloth to allow airflow, necessary for acetic acid fermentation. It also kept out any debris. The fermentation process takes time, usually around 3 to 4 weeks. During this period, natural yeast and bacteria will turn the sugary water into alcohol first, then into the tangy, rich vinegar we all love. I always use a dish underneath my jars when fermenting to capture any potential spillage, and I soon had bubbling fermentation. It's important to keep the apple scraps submerged below the liquid. This helps to prevent mold growth. And every few days I'd use a spoon to press down any floating apple bits until the bubbling fermentation settled down. This took about 2 to 3 weeks. Once it smelled tangy and there were no more bubbles, I filtered out the fruit and returned the liquid to a clean jar. Then I let the liquid continue fermenting for another 2 to 4 weeks, checking the tang and pH along the way. I relied on the smell to tell me when to check the pH. For apple cider vinegar to be shelf-stable, the pH should be below 4.6. As the vinegar fermented, a pellicle formed on the surface. This is a natural part of the process, similar to the SCOBY we see in kombucha. The pellicle is made up of beneficial bacteria and yeast, which is essential to the fermentation process. And when everything was just right, I used a funnel to transfer the vinegar into a flip-top bottle for storage in a cool location out of direct sunlight. Instead of discarding the pellicle, I'm keeping it in the jar with about a cup of vinegar to kickstart the next batch of apple cider vinegar. Alternatively, the pellicle could be composted instead. It's full of nutrients and will break down naturally, enriching the compost pile. With the applesauce and apple cider vinegar ready, I thought it would be perfect to create a salad that brings everything together. I started by turning leftover sourdough bread into croutons, crispy, golden, and full of flavor. It just so happened that a deep freeze was expected soon, so I went ahead and harvested the last of the garden lettuce, still fresh and crisp. To make the dressing, I began by grating a clove of garlic. I used the applesauce along with some of my homemade maple syrup and the new vinegar. A touch of Dijon mustard added just the right bite, and toasted walnut oil for smoothness. A little salt and pepper to round things out. I gave it a shake and let the flavors mingle a bit while I made the salad. Tossed with leftover turkey, some still warm bacon for a little indulgence, and a generous crumble of gorgonzola and those crunchy croutons, this salad was everything. A mix of savory, tangy, and a bit of sweetness with each bite.